Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Gracias por acompañarnos esta tarde. We'll start the webinar in just a moment. Esperamos la presentación en unos minutos. My name is Daniel Weinsweg, and I'm part of the board of Los Cien. Mi nombre es Daniel Weinsweg y formo parte de la mesa de Los Cien. To start, we'd like to share a few housekeeping items for the webinar. This event is being simultaneously translated in Spanish. Este evento está siendo transmitido en vivo en español. To access that feature, click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish. Para acceder a este servicio, favor de oprimir el botón al fondo de su pantalla y seleccionar el botón para español. We'd like to give a huge thank you to Betsy Chavez from Hannah Institute, who is helping with the translation services and has for many of our programs. Le damos gracias a Betsy Chavez con Hannah Institute, quien nos brinda la interpretación al español esta tarde. For this webinar, we invite the audience to submit questions using the Q&A function, also at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to submit questions and upvote the ones that you'd like answered most. After we hear Richard's remarks, we're going to have the opportunity to ask those questions, and there's a lot of folks watching tonight, so please make sure you get your questions in, and if you see some good questions that you really want answered, make sure to give those a thumbs up. Before we get going, we'd like to give a huge thanks to our event sponsors for making this event happen. Press Democrat for the generous ad space donations, the City of Santa Rosa, St. Joseph's Health, Sonoma Clean Power, Community Foundation of Sonoma County, Burbank Housing, and more. Los Cien is really excited to partner with Generation Housing for this important conversation. Our mission at Los Cien is to build bridges in our community, and we do this by hosting events, convening conversations, and connecting our community around issues of grave importance. We're thrilled to partner with Generation Housing, who is dedicated to increasing housing equity here in Sonoma County. When our community has stable housing, we all benefit. Unfortunately, decades of inequitable policies, nationally and locally, have resulted in the sorry state of affairs we find ourselves in. And it is impacting the quality of our schools, the sustainability of our businesses, and most importantly, the health of our neighbors, individually and collectively. It's my honor to work with Generation Housing, and on behalf of Los Cien, I'm excited to introduce my friend, colleague, and her newest title, the Executive Director of Generation Housing, Jenny Close.
Hi, thank you, Daniel, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. Generation Housing is in its first year of advocating for more diverse and more affordable housing. We don't do it for developers, we don't do it for builders, we do this because we know that safe and stable and affordable housing is the prescription for good health and is at the center of healthy communities. Unfortunately, health, education, wealth outcomes, even life expectancy can be predicted by zip codes still. The kind of home you live in, where it sits, and whether you own it matters. Now, segregation, which we're going to talk tonight, is a loaded word. It's a loaded topic. And there are some people who believe it's an academic discussion, that it's part of our history. But it's not, and you'll hear that tonight. Sonoma County is not unique in that it remains largely geographically segregated. Its schools, in fact, are as segregated as pre-civil rights era Southern schools. And tonight you're going to hear that segregation is not an accident. Our speaker tonight will talk about the history of how our government created policy that segregated America. Now, I think this is going to move you to action. So please stay to the end where we'll briefly talk about how you can take action to address segregation and housing right here at home in Sonoma County. Also, please stay to the end because I'll tell you how you can get one of these books practically free. So with that, I am honored to introduce our guest speaker for the evening. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of economic policy of the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, published in 2017, and lots of other books. Richard, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks to all of you who have come here this evening to engage with me in this conversation. Let me begin by reminding all of us that we had a civil rights movement in this country in the 1960s and the 20th century. It began in the 1930s by challenging segregation in colleges and universities, and then went on, as I think most of you know, to challenge segregation in elementary and secondary schools, and in 1954 won a Supreme Court decision, excuse me, that prohibited legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision stimulated, inspired, motivated a movement of activists who engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience, local organizing to challenge segregation throughout the country. It succeeded in persuading much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. The civil rights movement succeeded in ending segregation in public accommodations, and started with sit-ins at lunch counters, in public transportation. Most of you have heard of the Montgomery bus boycott in Rosa Parks. And yet, at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much ended in this country, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated, like Sonoma. Clearly defined areas that are all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that are all Black or mostly Black. How could it be that the civil rights movement persuaded the country that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both Blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy? How could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? I've lived in many metropolitan areas. Every one that I've lived in was residentially segregated. Well, partly I think it's hard to redress residential segregation. If we passed an ordinance prohibiting segregation in restaurants, the next day you can sit in any restaurant, go to any restaurant you want. But if we passed a law prohibiting segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, Blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Northerners, Southerners, Easterners, Westerners, we've adopted a national excuse, a rationalization we give ourselves for failing to follow through with the civil rights movement to end residential segregation. And the rationalization goes something like this. The segregation of the colleges and schools and lunch counters and buses, all of that was done by government, by law, by regulation, by public policy. If the federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation, a civil rights violation that required us as American citizens to remedy it. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a 14th Amendment violation, also required a remedy as a civil rights violation. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government, wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. It just sort of happened naturally. It happened because maybe bigoted landlords and homeowners refused to rent or sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it happened because bigoted private sector businesses like real estate agencies or banks or developers refused to sell to African Americans in particular, and Hispanics as well, in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it happened because people just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. And so segregation just happens out of our choice. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all because of economic differences. Many African Americans and Hispanics cannot afford to live in higher opportunity, mostly white middle-class neighborhoods. And that's why segregation happened. All of these individual, personal, bigoted, non-governmental, self-choice, economic factors is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves that, oh, what happened by accident could only unhappen by accident. Most of us don't feel like it's a good thing. We don't like living in an apartheid society, but we think there's nothing we can do about it. We give a name to this rationalization. It's a name we all use. You're all familiar with it. What we say we have in this country is de facto segregation, something that's just happened in fact, but not in law. Well, I spent a lot of time a number of years ago writing about education policy. I really didn't know much about housing or neighborhood segregation, but I came to understand that the education policy that we were following in this country made no sense. We had the idea that the reason that African American children in particular, Hispanic children to some extent, low-income children to some extent, the reason that they achieved at lower levels on average than white children was because teachers had low expectations of them. And if only we could force teachers to try harder, to really try to teach minority children, their achievement would rise and the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a kind of silly, ludicrous theory, but it was widely accepted. As you may know, in 2001, we passed a law that was bipartisan, supported both by civil rights advocates and Democrats and Republicans, called the No Child Left Behind law. And the No Child Left Behind law said if we simply test children more often, hold teachers accountable for those test scores, that will make them try harder and the achievement gap will disappear. As I said, I thought this was a ludicrous theory, but it was widely accepted. Of course, there are some teachers who are bigoted, who have low expectations of children who are not white, but that's not the main reason why we have an achievement gap in schools. The main reason we have an achievement gap in schools is because so many low-income African-American children in particular come to school with social and economic disadvantages that make it impossible for many of them to take advantage of what even good schools have to offer. So I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, African-American children in urban neighborhoods in many cities in this country have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving down their streets, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who does not to be up at night wheezing, come to school drowsing the next day, sleepless perhaps. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement, not by a lot, but a sleepier group of children is going to have lower achievement than a well-rested group of children. I say not by a lot, and it's not, but then you begin to think of all the other conditions, similar conditions that African-American children in particular come to school with. Asthma, lead poisoning, it has a measurable impact on IQ, homelessness, economic insecurity. When you add these all up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. And then I began to realize that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. What happens if every child in a school has one or more of these conditions? How is such a school ever going to be expected to have achievement at the same level as a school where children come well-rested, in good health, well-nourished, in economically secure homes? Obviously, you can't expect that. I mean, you can pass a law saying it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen, and it didn't happen as a result of that law being passed. The achievement gap is pretty much the same as it was in 2001 when that law was passed. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And in truth, schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think of neighborhood segregation as a school problem. That's the origins of this book that I wrote. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. It was involved two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them had a very, very minor school desegregation plan. They allowed parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend, but if the choice was going to intensify segregation, that wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't do so. So if you had a school that was all white or mostly white, and both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, black child be given some preference. A very, very trivial program. You don't have one place left very often, and both a black and a white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court evaluated this program, denounced it. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained in his opinion that, yeah, it's true, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, but he said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And then he went on to explain all the reasons that those neighborhoods were segregated de facto, because of private bigotry or actions of private businesses or people's desire to live with each other of the same race or economic differences. He said government had nothing to do with the segregation of Louisville and Seattle. And if government didn't have anything to do with it, government is prohibited from doing anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision, the Supreme Court decision, and it reminded me of something I read about some years before that happened in one of those cities, Louisville, Kentucky. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. The white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the downtown area of St. Louis. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child. He wanted to move out of the downtown area. Nobody would sell him a home. So the white homeowner in this all-white suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. When the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob of neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop them. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police did not interfere. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the courts, the prosecutors are all lined up to enforce racial boundaries in Louisville, every one of these is state actors violating the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, creating civil rights violations when they enforce segregation in this way. I began to look into it further, and I learned that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. Hundreds and hundreds of cases of police protected, frequently police organized and led mob violence that drove African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. These instances happened all across the country, in California, in Northern California, in Southern California, in Denver, and Chicago, and Kansas City, and Pittsburgh, and you could name them all over the country. There were these violent incidents with police protecting, and every one of them was a 14th Amendment violation, a violation of the Constitution, a civil rights violation. that we as Americans have an obligation to remedy, and we've never done so? Well, I decided to look into it a bit further and found that it wasn't just police protected violence that created segregation in this country, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies that were racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans in particular and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of the country. Every one of them was a civil rights violation. The policies were so numerous, so racially explicit, that we have a system not of de facto segregation, but of unconstitutional segregation, that we have as much of an obligation to remedy as we did to undo the segregation of restaurants or buses or employment or any of the other things we addressed in the 20th century. Well, let me, in the few minutes that we have together this evening, describe some of the major federal policies that were employed to create segregation. Perhaps the most powerful of these was a program of the Federal Housing and Administration and Veterans Administration in the period immediately after World War II, when millions of returning war veterans were coming home needing housing. The federal government embarked upon a program to move the entire white working class, middle class population out of cities into single family homes and suburban communities that would be all white. This was an explicit racial program. These suburbs that were created by the federal government on a racially explicit basis were created everywhere in the country, created a white noose around downtown areas populated mostly by African Americans. You know these suburbs, I'm sure they exist in every metropolitan area. I don't know specific names of them in Sonoma County, but I can certainly tell you about San Francisco or the East Bay, places like Westlake and Daly City, or San Lorenzo and the East Bay, or in Los Angeles, places like Lakewood and Panorama City, or Westchester, or on the East Coast, Levittown is a big one. All of these suburbs were created on a racially explicit basis by the federal government for whites only. We were not at that time a suburban country yet. The only people living in suburbs at the time were affluent people. Working class families, middle class families didn't have automobiles to drive to work, so they had to live near their workplaces, which were mostly factories or the banks and other service industries that were serving those factories. The factories had to be located near a deep water port or a railroad terminal to get their parts or ship their final products. So most Americans, black and white, were living in downtown areas at the time. Many of them in integrated neighborhoods because they all had to live close enough to their workplaces to get to work. The federal government decided to move the white population out of those urban areas. The developers could never have assembled the capital on their own to build those homes, to buy the land. No bank would be crazy enough to lend them the money to do that. These were giant suburbs. Westlake and Daly City, for example, 15,000 homes. The builder of Westlake, his name was Henry Dolger, had no way to build those homes without going to the federal government, submitting his plans for the development, the construction materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets, the architectural design of the homes, and a federally required commitment that he would only sell the home to Caucasians. The federal government even required that he place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to non-whites or rental to non-whites. This was a racially explicit program of the Federal Housing Administration. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. The Federal Housing Administration had a manual distributed to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders who wanted to create suburban communities. The manual said you could not approve an application of a builder for a federally guaranteed loan if the builder was going to sell homes to African American families in white neighborhoods. You couldn't even approve a federal bank guarantee for a loan to a builder of an all-white subdivision if that subdivision was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. We don't have a de facto segregated country. We have an unconstitutionally segregated country by federal policy. Well, in my book, The Color of Law, I show a picture. There's a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that a developer of an all-white project in Michigan was required by the Federal Housing Administration to construct to separate his project from a nearby African-American neighborhood to prevent African Americans from ever crossing the street to enter that all-white community. Once the builder had constructed that wall, the Federal Housing Administration was willing to guarantee his bank loans to build the project. And this went on, as I said, all over the country. Let me carry this illustration a little bit further. But I want to say, though, that this is not the only policy the federal government followed. There were many, many others, but this one had a particular impact that we still feel today. Those homes in the subdivisions that were created for whites only, creating a white noose around every metropolitan area, were inexpensive when they were built. They were for returning war veterans, people who had working class jobs in the post-World War II boom. They sold at the time for about $8,000 or $9,000, at the most $10,000. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Any working class family with a job in the post-war economy could afford a home for $100,000, especially if it was a returning war veteran, no down payment was required. They can get a mortgage from the Federal Housing Administration or Veterans Administration. The whites bought those homes for $100,000 in today's money. African Americans were prohibited, even though they could easily have afforded them, prohibited from purchasing those homes. Over the next few generations, those homes gained in value as they appreciated, as the neighborhood's property values increased. They now sell not for $100,000, but for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, like the Bay Area, $1 million or more. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government to leave cities and move into these neighborhoods gained wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of emergencies, medical or temporary unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this program that generated wealth. The result is today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. You would think if people have similar incomes, they'd have similar wealth. You'd expect there to be a 60% wealth ratio as well, if there's a 60% income ratio. But the enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. That's never been remedied, that we, all of us, have never taken upon ourselves an obligation to remedy. Well, that wealth gap determines much of the racial inequality that we have today by leaving African Americans in particular in low-income segregated neighborhoods and urban areas and moving whites out of those areas. It predicts the achievement gap that I began talking with you about this evening, where African-American children in particular have lower average achievement than white children. It predicts health disparities between African-Americans and whites. African-Americans, as you probably know, have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, in significant part because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, less access to grocery stores that sell fresh food. It predicts the mass incarceration of both African-American and Hispanic young men today, which would not exist to nearly the extent it does without racial segregation. I'm not suggesting that no police officers would ever abuse African-American or Hispanic men were it not for segregation, but segregation makes it much more likely and frequent and intense when you concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or the transportation to get to them, or schools that are high achieving. It's inevitable that the police will engage in confrontations with those young men and will lead to the kind of tragic abuse that we've spent so much time demonstrating about in the last few months, as well as the mass incarceration of young men. And the wealth gap and the segregation that it created has another very, very dangerous and frightening effect. And that's the extreme political polarization that we have in this country today that we're so focused on in this present very dangerous period. The political polarization is not entirely racial, but as we all know, it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's necessary to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites in particular live so far from each other that we have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other, no ability, as I said, to develop a common national identity that's essential for the preservation of democracy? So the civil rights violations that created this segregation and that determine it to a large extent today, in part through this wealth gap, is a source of enormous threat to this country, to this society, and we have an obligation as well as a necessity as American citizens to redress it. Well, let me conclude before we get into a discussion by saying this. The policies to redress segregation are well known. Think tanks, policy experts, journalists like me, we write about policies that can redress segregation all the time. There's no mystery about them. They generally fall into four broad areas. One are policies to improve the resources, the quality of low-income segregated neighborhoods. We know how to do that. Another is policies to prevent the massive displacement of existing residents who are typically lower income African Americans or Hispanics, prevent their displacement when those neighborhoods undergo gentrification. A third is opening up segregated white neighborhoods to more diverse residents. And the fourth is stabilizing the desegregation of neighborhoods that are in transition, either urban neighborhoods that are transitioning from being low-income segregated to high-income segregated, or suburban neighborhoods that are transitioning from being all white to greater numbers of African Americans in particular. Those are the four areas that policy should address, but the policies are easy to understand. What's missing, let me say, is not policy ideas. What's missing is, a new civil rights movement, like the civil rights movement of the 1960s, that's going to make it uncomfortable not to implement the kinds of policies that will redress the unconstitutional segregation of this country. I am now involved in the creation with some civil rights leaders from around the country of a new national committee to redress racial segregation. That committee was about to launch before the pandemic hit. It's been put on pause, but it will soon be launched again. I certainly hope that you in Sonoma County will participate in this national movement to redress segregation in housing. And if that happens, we have a chance of changing the direction of this country from the apartheid system that we have. We are now having, I will say, a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than we ever have had before in American history. The Black Lives Matter demonstrations enrolled 25 million Americans in cities all across the country. In many cases, actually in most cases, whites dominated these demonstrations, unheard of at any period in the past. We have white elected Southern politicians running around the South, removing statues that commemorate the defenders of slavery, also unheard of at any time in the past. We have a discussion going on in this country about the history, not just because of my book. There are many books that are now very widely read and exploring this. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates on reparations. If you look at the bestseller lists of books, you'll find almost all of them, nonfiction books, almost all of them deal with race. So we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow than we ever have had before. And I think there's cause for hope that out of that discussion, out of the Black Lives Matter movement, a new civil rights movement will emerge that will challenge the residential segregation that characterizes this entire country and that underlies almost all of the inequality that so threatens our democracy. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I apologize, I was not able to talk about many of the policies that the federal, state, and local governments followed to ensure segregation in this country. There were many, many others besides the ones that I described. The police violence, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, creation of all white suburbs. But I hope I've given you a taste of the kinds of policies that existed. And if you're interested in learning about many more of them, I've described them in The Color of Law. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'd be glad to engage in a conversation in whatever time we have left. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much. I want to remind the audience that we've got about 15 minutes or so for audience Q&A. So I want to encourage everyone to submit your questions, and I see some coming in. Richard, I want to make sure that one detail that stood out about the book early on is your connection to seeing segregation, housing segregation in some of the more liberal enclaves and you start by talking about segregation in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it resonated deeply. You give this example of Milpitas. And I want to make sure we get to these questions. I want to start just by asking about if you can describe and unpack a little bit about that example of Milpitas, and if you could share a little bit about the role that zoning played in that story and other stories, just seeing how some of that ties to present day.
Sure. Jesus knows that in this book, where I can, I try to talk about the self-satisfied smug places like the Bay Area that think they're better than other places, but which perpetrated through public policy the same kind of segregation that was done elsewhere in the country. What Jesus was referring to was a situation that happened in the East Bay during World War II. There was hundreds of thousands of African Americans as well as whites migrated to this area to take jobs in war plants, war industry, shipyards, In the book, I talk about one of those plants. It was a Ford Motor plant in Richmond. Maybe some of you have been to it. It's now been converted to a museum called the Rosie the Riveter Museum in Richmond. It was a Ford plant that during World War II was converted to the production of Jeeps and tanks. And workers from the South and Midwest and West, white and black, migrated to California to take jobs in that plant and in the shipyards. That Ford plant after World War II was converted back to civilian production, to automobile production. And in 1955, when the highways came to be built, it was no longer necessary for automobile plants to be located in a deep water port like Richmond, because it no longer needed to get its parts and ship its final products by rail and ship. Highways were being built, and so the plants could relocate to rural areas, to suburban areas. And that Ford plant relocated to Milpitas, as Jesus mentioned. The UAW, the United Auto Workers, negotiated a contract with the Ford company that permitted all the workers in the Ford company in Richmond, about 25% of them were African American, permitted all of them to keep their jobs if they moved to Milpitas, if they went to the Milpitas plant. The problem was that the white workers could move and keep their jobs because there was plenty of housing available for white workers in Milpitas. A number of these suburbs had been built under the program I described of the FHA and VA. But black workers couldn't move there. If they wanted to keep their jobs, they had to drive 50 miles each way to commute to keep those jobs, because the government would not finance the creation of subdivisions if African Americans were going to live there. So that's just one example. I'll give you another example of the East Bay, if you like. During World War II, for the hundreds of thousands of workers who were in the shipyards, the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, needed housing when they came here, and the government built housing for them. It did this all over the country where there were war plants, everywhere segregating it, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. For the Kaiser shipyards, the federal government built housing along Albany and Berkeley, San Pablo Avenue, if you know that region, where the residential and retail shopping exists for white workers. The African Americans were segregated in separate housing along the railroad tracks and in the industrial areas near the bay, separated from the white workers. At the end of World War II, Congress required the government to get rid of its war housing projects. In many parts of the country, local housing authorities took them over and created public housing projects out of these war housing projects. But in the East Bay, the towns of Berkeley and Albany and the University of California at Berkeley, that owned some of the land, refused to take over those war housing plants. They said that the area wasn't suitable for housing, and they demolished those the housing, the segregated housing. The white workers had no difficulty finding housing in the broader Berkeley, Oakland area. Black workers couldn't find housing. The city of Berkeley eventually hired a social worker to place them in public housing in Oakland. The projects were demolished because, as I said, the university and the cities of Berkeley and Albany said that wasn't an area that was suitable for housing. And once they were demolished and the black workers in particular were placed in public housing elsewhere, the University of California decided that was a good place for housing after all, and built a university village, which is now housing for graduate students and faculty members. So that's just a little aspect of this story from the East Bay.
Richard, thank you for that. We've got a question here from Herman, who asks, how do you change the minds of the 64% of white Americans who think the legacy of segregation is either a quote minor factor or no factor at all in today's white-black wealth gap?
Well, we keep on educating. A lot of minds have been changed in the last few years. As I said before, we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about these issues than we ever have had before in American history. If you somehow could do a survey today and 10 years ago about these issues, you find that enormous numbers of minds have been changed. But to change more minds, we need to continue educating people. As I've working with this group, as I mentioned, of national civil rights leaders to create a national committee to redress racial segregation. Among the things we've done is created a curriculum for schools that will teach this history accurately. In the color of law, as you may recall, I survey all the textbooks that are commonly used in American history courses in high schools across the country, and find that they all lie about the history. They all promote the de facto segregation myth that the government had nothing to do with this. They boast about the suburbanization of the country that the FHA created, never mentioning that African Americans were excluded. They boast about the great work that the New Deal did in creating housing, never mentioning that it was always segregated housing that it created. Well, one of the things that a local committee could do, that your group could do, is examine the curriculum of high schools in Sonoma County and see if it's teaching this history accurately. And if not, conduct a campaign to get it to teach it accurately. I can send you, if after this event is over, if you like, a link to this curriculum. It's free. We also created a 17-minute animated video for high school students, also free. And this is something that everybody can do to begin to expand the education of people who don't understand the history at this point. Because, if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than ours has, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So it's essential that as a very first step, we challenge the way schools are teaching this history. And I guarantee you this, if you conducted a campaign around how schools in Sonoma County were teaching the history, not just of that I've described, but of slavery and of Jim Crow and of segregation, that campaign about how schools are teaching it will leak out into the adult community, and you might educate some adults as well.
Thank you, Richard. The next question that we have here is asking what is the one, and asks just one policy. So what is the one policy Sonoma County elected officials can implement right now or reform that will have the most impact between our communities when it comes to the wealth gap?
Well, you have to understand I'm not that familiar with Sonoma County. But I will say that the most, Sonoma County has a lot of high. Hello? Sonoma County. Sonoma County has a lot of high value property that generates a lot of income on property taxes. It could use some of that income to establish a down payment assistance program that would assist working class, middle class African-American families in particular to move to communities that are now unaffordable to them, but that would have been affordable to them when they were created and when they were excluded. So that would be one policy that could be implemented. I'll mention a second. You asked me only for one, but I'll mention the second. And that is one of the impediments to desegregating all white communities is the fact that many of them have zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of anything but single family homes on large lot sizes. That makes it virtually certain that they won't desegregate because you can't build townhouses or garden apartments or condominiums or even low-level apartment buildings. In my judgment, in my view, every community should have a mix of housing for affluent, for market rate, for moderate income families, for workforce and for low-income families. And a first step, it won't do it on its own, but the first step is to change zoning laws so that that kind of diversity is permitted.
And Richard, I think the way that folks often I've heard this described is the exclusionary zoning as one way of sort of describing what you just mentioned there. And I want to transition to the next question that we have here that I think maybe speaks to some of this. And they ask, can you speak about housing projects for low-income citizens, and how did government policy enforce segregation with regard to housing projects?
Well, I addressed that a little bit earlier when I talked about war housing projects. Most of us think of public housing as a place where poor people live. That's not how it started. Public housing began in this country during the New Deal in the Depression in the 1930s. We had a 25% unemployment rate at that time. Public housing wasn't for the unemployed. It was for the 75% who had good jobs, who could afford to pay the full rent in public housing. So it wasn't subsidized. But everywhere that the government built the public housing, it segregated it, creating separate projects for African Americans, separate projects for whites, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Because as I said before, there were many integrated neighborhoods in downtowns, in factory districts. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, wrote in his autobiography how he grew up in the early 20th century in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. It's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today, as being an integrated place. But he says he went to an integrated high school. His best friend in school, in high school, he said, was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. We had an integrated high school and an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration, one of the first New Deal agencies, went into this neighborhood of Cleveland and demolished housing and created two separate projects. One for African Americans, one for whites, a blatant civil rights unconstitutional policy of civil rights violation, unconstitutional. And with those segregated projects and others in the Cleveland area, reinforced, created, sustained a pattern of segregation that exists to this day. I mentioned before that in The Color of Law, I like to speak about the self-satisfied smug places. Another one, you're not the only one, the Bay Area. There are other places as well. One of them I refer to in the book is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Maybe you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white and half black. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and created two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it otherwise would never have existed.
Thank you, Richard. It looks like at the top we've got a quick comment I want to shout out here. It says, let's make sure that Santa Rosa City Schools adopt this teaching module that you were referring to earlier for our history teachers, hashtag legacy of equity. So, and we've got a number of educators in the audience. It looks like some other folks as well asking for the links of for this content. So we'll make sure we get that shared after the webinar. We'll make sure we connect with Richard and we share that with folks as well. So thank you for mentioning that. And then
I'll send
Richard, you also
an email tomorrow that you can distribute to attendees that include the links to these free materials as well as some other things.
That sounds great. And Richard, you also mentioned the new Civil Rights Committee that somebody's asking about and how they can learn more about that.
I'll include that in my email to you tomorrow as well, and you can distribute that to attendees.
Okay, that sounds great. And then so we'll leave with just one last question, and then we'll turn it over to Jenny, who will help close us out for the evening. But the last question that we have here is, how can housing ever desegregate if it remains the main vehicle for investment in the U.S.? Is it possible for housing to desegregate, if it remains a commodity?
Well, I'm not going to put in those kinds of technical economic terms, but we can accomplish desegregation with common sense regulatory reforms. We can, as I mentioned earlier, subsidize. There are many communities that have down payment assistance programs that assist, excuse me, particularly African American, Hispanic, low-income minority families to purchase homes that they otherwise could not do because of the wealth gap. We could, as a federal program, which we're nowhere near able to do now because of lack of political support, but we could be subsidizing families who, because of their race, were excluded from communities when they were affordable, and now can no longer afford to move to these communities because they've increased in value so much. Well, these are the kinds of policies we should follow and can follow, and it would have an effect in desegregating this country.
Well, thank you, Richard, and I want to thank you for the remarks about your book, and I want to thank everybody in the audience for the excellent questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Jen Close, who's with us, and she'll help close us out.
Thank you, Jesus, and thank you again, Richard, for joining us tonight for this really important conversation on housing and racial justice in America, and also here in Sonoma County. We also struggle with this here in Sonoma County, like I said at the beginning, and I'll tell you, the Othering and Belonging Institute, which you're a part, actually shows that the cities of Santa Rosa and Healdsburg are more than 80% single-family zone, over 80% exclusionary zoning. And if you look at the map, it actually looks at every jurisdiction in our county, except Rohnert Park, is more than 80% exclusionary zoning. So that is a lot. And shout out to Rohnert Park for the work it's done on multifamily housing and different kinds of zoning. So I said at the beginning that we talked a little bit about action, because I think that the people who are here are interested in taking action to change things. So first of all, you did it last week, and you need to keep doing it, and that's to vote. Elections have consequences, and I just want to say that to really shine a light on this particular issue, because Donald Trump, our current president, vowed to protect the suburbs by protecting exclusionary zoning. Some thought it was a racist dog whistle. President-elect Joe Biden's housing policy, on the other hand, actually requires states receiving community development block grants, which is pretty much all of them, to develop an inclusionary housing policy and give states grants to assist jurisdictions in seeking to eliminate exclusionary zoning. So this is a really big change, and that is voting. And then on the local level, there are changes that can be made regarding zoning. In 2018, Minneapolis took the lead and abolished exclusionary zoning, and Seattle, Portland fell close on its heels. So there are things that we can do locally around zoning that make really big changes. And Gen H really wants to be a leader in that, but we need you to be part of us so that we can make changes there. We are a membership-driven organization. We will keep you informed and let you know when it's time to step up and speak out, and save some dates on your calendar to show up at meetings and say that we're demanding changes. So if you want to become a member, and we need you to become a member to help us advocate for changes in housing and for more affordable housing, then you can go to our website at generation.org/membership. And I think maybe Jesus can put it in the chat for us. And if you do it today, you will get one of these books for free. Oh, look at that. For today, and all you got to do is go on to the website and put in the coupon code area equity, the word equity. If you do that at any level, you get one for free. If you join at $50, you get one of these cool T-shirts that Jesus and I are wearing today. But there's a level for everybody. We understand that times are tough right now, so we just want you to be part of our organization so that we can help really move the needle on housing here in a way that is equitable. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here tonight and for continuing to come back to our webinars, trying to give you quality content, good information that can help us make Sonoma County more equitable, specifically in the housing area. All right, thank you very much. Everybody stay safe and stay healthy. We look forward to seeing you again.
Day. I've got nothing more to say at the end of my line. There's a clearing